Boker Tov, good morning, and to all the dear colleagues and friends, the participants of this 5th International Conference on the Future of Holocaust testimonies, and I would say especially to all partners for several projects, Wolf Brunner and Thomas Kaplan. I can recommend their places for you to go over there, have a fellowship and stay there, especially far away in the Appalachian Mountains in Boone. So first of all, I want to express my deep appreciation for Dr. Boaz Cohen, the initiator of the Holocaust Studies program at this college, which I must say is so successful, and of a series of conferences on Holocaust testimonies. Boaz also succeeded in getting into his program two other fine scholars, Dr. Mary Offer, also supervised by me, and Dr. Yaron Pasher, former PhD student of Professor Dina Porat, and our keynote speaker of today, Professor Gerhard Weinberg. So I thank them for inviting me to chair this session, and I will introduce Professor Weinberg. For those of you who are not acquainted with him, you should. I would say he is kind of a phenomenon, a human being but a phenomenon. Born in Hanover in Germany on the 1st of January 1928. So being born on the first day of a new year is already an indication that one is a Yekke. Being precise, not wasting a moment. He emigrated with his family to the United States in 1938, preceding Wolf Brunner and Thomas Kaplan for several years, and later served in the US Army in 1946-47. In 1948, he started his academic studies, which culminated in a PhD in history at the University of Chicago in 1951 on German relations with Russia, 1939-1941, subsequently published in 1954 as Germany and the Soviet Union, 1939-1941. He then worked on Columbia University's war documentation project between the years 51-54, in the former century, of course, and established the American Historical Association project program for microfilm the captured German documents. The enormous amount of documents that he read during those years served as a firm basis for his studies throughout his career. One special finding from those years, in 1958, was the manuscript of the second book written by Adolf Hitler, which had not been published. Professor Weinberg published German and English editions of this second book, and this was welcomed at the time by the scholarly community throughout. I thought much about this 3-4 years ago when there were heated debates about the scholarly edition of Mein Kampf. There were no such debates 60 years ago, and this says something about the changes that occurred in the domain of memory of World War II and the Shoah, and this has to do, of course, also with the impact of testimonies and the involvement of survivors in the cult of memory of the Shoah. Professor Weinberg has taught at the University of Chicago, Kentucky, Michigan, and North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the last university being his academic home since 1974. When he retired, he was succeeded by Christopher Browning, who also retired several years ago. So it's an excellent track for retiring. He is a member of numerous professional associations and organizations and chaired several of them. And additionally, he served on and chaired several U.S. government advisory committees. So he's retired, but isn't tired. His oeuvre is impressive. He authored or edited 11 books, including World in the Balance, Behind the Scenes of World War II, Hitler's Foreign Policy, 1933-1939, The Road to World War II, Visions of Victory, The Hopes of Aid World War two leaders, and has a long list, over 100 of chapters, articles, guides to archives, and other publications. One of my favorites is his A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II, which is, I believe, the Bible of World War II military and political history. I thought of bringing it here today, but it is 1,200 pages, it's very heavy, so I didn't. In his writings, Professor Weinberg gives a central place to the Holocaust, and that's very important in this genre of writing about the war. In June 2009, he received the Pritzker Military Library Literature Award for Lifetime Excellence in Military Writing, and in 2011 he was awarded the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize, a Lifetime Achievement Award given by the Society for Military History. I personally had the pleasure to edit two of his articles based on keynote lectures he gave at Yad Vashem conferences, the 2004 conference that dealt with Holocaust historiography, and the 2012 conference that dealt with the end of 1942 as a turning point in World War II and the awareness of the final solution. It was really a great pleasure to edit his articles because I hardly had to do anything. They were so well written, which is an advice also for those who still write a PhD thesis. So the topic of his keynote lecture today is the Holocaust 75 years after it ended. Professor Weinberg, the floor is yours. Or the seat is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Is this working? Yes. And I do want to thank College Western Galilee for inviting me and taking care of me, and I hope I will not put you all to sleep early this morning. As we look back today on what has come to be called the Holocaust, we recognize that after 75 years, both the survivors and the perpetrators are for the most part, no longer with us, and the few who remain are unlikely to remain with us much longer. The opportunity for scholars and serious journalists to interview individuals who might have and might be willing to share experiences and knowledge of the events of the 40s is disappearing. We are no longer in a good position to hear the voices of people with personal experiences and have to rely on whatever they said or wrote in the past, as long as that information is both accessible and preserved, two subjects to which I will turn in the latter part of this talk. The very substantial attention that has been accorded to the most recent trial in Germany of a functionary at Auschwitz is undoubtedly related to the fact that most of the last surviving perpetrator are escaping trial by passing on. But this one, who was actually brought into court, died before beginning to serve his jail sentence. There was considerable public attention to the subject of the horrors inflicted by Nazi Germany when some of the camps were liberated in 1945 and pictures appeared in newspapers and the then quite important newsreels, as well as what was mentioned in the broadcasts of some reporters. There was again some interest at the time of the main trial at Nuremberg when movie films on camps and related atrocities were shown. Although there was discussion and grief in the Jewish community, and some men who had served in the army and seen the horrors of the camps tried to make sure that the crimes thereafter simply did not disappear. But the scholarly community generally avoided the subject. When in 1951, after finishing my PhD, I became one of the original members of the War Documentation Project, sponsored by the US Air Force, I developed a friendship with another original member of the group, who was then still working on his PhD dissertation at Columbia University, Raoul Hilberg. He was preparing a work on the systematic killing of Jews, what we now call the Holocaust. After he finished the dissertation and revised it some for publication, he was for years unable to get it published, as one publisher after another turned it down. A gracious person provided the subsidy that enabled the not very well-known Chicago publisher Quadrangle Books to issue it in 1961. This book, entitled The Destruction of the European Jews, may be said to have played an important part in opening the gates to serious work on the subject, and it is thus not surprising that it is now in its third and 3-volume edition published by Yale University Press. Like Hilberg in the 1950s, most of those who in the 1960s looked into the subject seriously utilized for their research the documents collected by the prosecution and the defense for the post-war trials at Nuremberg. This was a historically unique form of opening of some government records within a few years of their creation, and the enormous assistance this has provided to scholars interested in the 1930s and 40s cannot be overestimated. There were, in addition, the transcripts of the main trial at Nuremberg and of the subsequent proceedings. Though very valuable, these materials did, however, have one significant impact on early work on the Holocaust that affected the perspectives of both scholars and the public. In the documents and trial transcripts, one heard and read the words of German government officials, policemen, soldiers, and defendants in post-war trials. But the voices of surviving victims were generally absent. This began to change a little with the 1961 trial of Adolf Iceman, in which quite deliberately survivors were brought into the court as witnesses. But it has taken considerable time for the evidence from the victims and bystanders to become integrated into the efforts to reconstruct and understand developments. For some time, there was a scholarly dispute between what were called intentionalists and functionalists. The former argued that the systematic killing of Jews was planned and ordered from the top, while the latter held that the process was one of steady radicalization, pushed forward over time by those involved in the persecution as they engaged in ever more radical procedures, culminating at some point in systematic mass killing. The careful attention to local detail and local initiatives that characterized the work of those who can be called and often considered themselves functionalists has certainly contributed greatly in our ability to follow the technical development of mass murder, the local variations that frequently occurred, and the extent to which individual police, military, and administrative personnel could and did exercise their own judgment about the procedures to be followed in practice. Whatever the prior developments in the making of local decisions as reconstructed by scholars, however, there can now no longer be any doubt about the very last possible date for a formal decision at the very top, even though some of those writing about the Holocaust still prefer to ignore the relevant evidence and continue to advance something of a functionalist interpretation. We know from the Romanian record that was determined to be accurate by the German official who checked it at the time, that when Adolf Hitler met Romanian dictator Marshal Ion Antonescu in Munich on June 12, 1941, the latter asked Hitler what was to be done about the Jews in the Soviet territory that their armies were about to invade. An important issue for Antonescu, since the area that would be seized initially was known to contain a very large Jewish population. Hitler told him that they were all to be killed, an instruction that the evidence indicates he had earlier orally given to Heinrich Himmler. We also now have a clear confirmation of the meeting before the invasion, at which a high SS official told the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen, the murder commandos, that they were to follow the German armies into the Soviet Union, and that a major part of their assignment was to kill all Jews in the territory the German and other Axis armies were about to occupy. I will come back to the source for this resolution of a subject that was once quite controversial, because in testimony after the war, there were variations in the accounts of this meeting. All the evidence we now have leaves no doubt that the commanders of the battalions of the Order Police, units with members more than 10 times as numerous as the Einsatzgruppen, were similarly instructed before the invasion of June 1941. Hitler's own telling the Minister of War of Croatia in late July 1941 that all Jews in Europe were to be killed, and his telling the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in November of the same year that all Jews in the Middle East and in the rest of the world were also to be killed, are both recorded in German diplomatic documents published decades ago, although these very clear and explicit records are still ignored all too often by scholars working in the field of Holocaust studies. A trend in the scholarship that has not moved as far or as widely as this speaker thinks is needed is that of the very close interrelationship of the war as a fight between Germany and those it attacked on the one hand and the Holocaust on the other. It is only quite recently that those writing books on the war, other than myself, include any reference to the Holocaust at all. And similarly, those who write on the Holocaust pay much too little attention to the realities of the fighting. Let me illustrate this issue with some examples. The murder commandos in many cases killed men, not whole families, in the first weeks of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This is occasionally adduced as evidence for a first step that would be followed by radicalization subsequently. What is missing here is any reference to the reality of the early fighting on the Eastern Front. The German assault surprised the Red Army that Stalin had held back as he disregarded all warnings from his own intelligence service and from the British and American governments. The German forces under these circumstances advanced very rapidly, and the German Army's Chief of Staff, General Franz Halder, was sure, on July 3rd, 1941, that the campaign had succeeded and that the rapid advance of German forces showed that a quick victory was certain. This meant, as a practical matter, that a murder commando that had to follow an advancing German military unit through some of the most densely Jewish settled part of Europe at the rate of about 30 miles a day was simply not in a position to do anything else. The members of the unit would shoot the local men and come back when the front slowed down to kill women and children. The unit's members did what they could under the circumstances of the moment and had no need either of new orders or the personal supervision of Heinrich Himmler, who, as we know, repeatedly came in the summer of 1941 to watch the progress of the new program entrusted to him, just as he would subsequently visit Auschwitz in the summer of 1942 to observe the killing procedure being implemented there. Neither Hitler nor Antonescu cared whether Jews were killed by shooting, gas, or other means. That was indeed a subject left to local initiative and preference, as long as the desired goal of systematic killing was kept in mind and attained as quickly as possible. A most critical point about the fighting, namely that the Allies first contained and then ended the Holocaust, also rarely receives the attention it deserves. Please do not be offended if I suggest that if the Germans had won and obtained control of the 47 of the then 48 states of the United States that the Japanese were willing for them to have, there would surely have been in any American group some who themselves or their parents or grandparents would have been killed because they're Jewish. Most in this audience would have been killed as Jews, some non-Jews because of some handicap, and some would have contracted polio and either died as a result or have been crippled and then been killed because the two doctors, Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, whose discoveries conquered the disease in the 1950s, would both have been killed because they were Jewish. On the other side of the interrelationship between the course of the fighting and the Holocaust, those who write endlessly about Erwin Rommel and his campaigns in North Africa generally ignore a key part of his assignment. He was originally sent there in April 1941 to salvage Italy's colony of Libya, lest the Italian people dump Mussolini when that colony was lost to British forces, the way Italy's colonies in Northeast Africa had been lost in the preceding months, a point that was a major worry of Hitler. But why push the Africa Corps, as it was called, on into Egypt and the Middle East in 1942, and do this at a time when the primary military theater for Germany was the Eastern Front, where things very obviously were not going the way Hitler and his generals had confidently anticipated. The Germans, from the summer of 1941 on, closed the Suez Canal to shipping by mining it. And they intended for Italy to have Egypt and the Middle East for its oil, while Germany would get its oil from the Caucasus. In spite of these realities and plans, and in spite of the necessity for a renewed major summer offensive against the Soviet Union, the moment in the summer of 1942 it looked as if the Africa Corps might get to Cairo and beyond, a special murder commando was attached to it. This was not done because Himmler wanted its members to get a good tan, or Hitler expected them to dismantle one of the pyramids so that it could be erected next to the Pergamum altar in Berlin. The whole point was that all Jews in the Middle East, about 1 million at the time, were to be killed before the area was turned over to Italy, because Hitler and Himmler, for good reasons of prior experience, did not trust the Italians to do so, but did trust Rommel to direct the murder commando to do what Hitler had personally promised the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem a little more than half a year earlier. The area could only be turned over to the Italians after an experienced murder commando under Rommel's supervision had accomplished its mission. On one highly significant relationship between the conduct of military operations and the Holocaust, there is the recently published book of Yaron Pasha that illustrates the way in which the German regime's priority of killing Jews at times directly impeded its own military operations. Just as much of the literature of the Holocaust ignores the interrelation of military operations with it, so too much of the literature on the fighting of World War II ignores the purpose for which Germany initiated the conflict: a worldwide demographic revolution in which the Germans and supposedly racially related peoples would alone inhabit the globe that had in the interim been totally cleansed of Jews. There is a further aspect of the second example I cited that is of major significance, but has also generally been ignored in the literature on both the war and on the Holocaust. In the crisis of the summer of 1942, as it looked as if the Germans might conquer much of the Middle East from the north or from the west, the Red Army, greatly aided by American aid, shipped to and then across Iran, held the German thrust into and through the Caucasus Mountains. At the same time, the British, also greatly aided by radical military measures personally ordered by President Roosevelt, held the Germans in North Africa. If it had not been for these actions of the three major allies, the Germans would have killed all Jews in the Palestine Mandate, and after an Allied victory in the war, in spite of the temporary loss of much of the Middle East, no one would have considered establishing a Jewish state in an area where there was not a single Jew. The state of Israel is one result of the success of the Allies in halting German advances in the Caucasus and North Africa in the summer of 1942, but you are unlikely to find any reference to this in the existing literature on either the war or the Holocaust. And I should add that this is a part of the answer to a question raised last night, how Jews in Israel are, in a way, escapees from the Holocaust. In connection with this development of the summer of 1942, there has also been another general omission from the literature on the fighting and on the Holocaust. The island of Madagascar is frequently mentioned in connection with the concept of sending Europe's Jews there, a concept raised in some quarters before the war and examined by German officials in the first year of the war, but a project that no one ever tried to implement. The real events that occurred in and about Madagascar and are actually of very great significance are, however, usually not reviewed in the literature of recent decades. In the spring of 1942, after the Japanese had conquered Malaya and Burma, they sent a large portion of their navy into the Indian Ocean. The Germans urged, and the Vichy government was prepared to accept, a Japanese occupation of Madagascar. Such a move would certainly interfere dramatically with British and American supplies and reinforcements to the Middle East and to the Soviet Union around the Cape of Good Hope and via Iran. In part, at the insistence of Prime Minister Jan Christian Smuts of the Union of South Africa, and with assistance from the United States, the British landed in force at the northern tip of Madagascar in May 1942, seized the base there, and in a campaign of 4 months conquered the whole Vichy-controlled island. If this had not happened, and instead the Japanese had taken control of the island, the Allied success in halting German advances and preventing a possible meeting of German and Japanese forces in the Middle East would have been most unlikely. How frequently have you been informed about these events concerning Madagascar in World War II? In recent decades, there have, on the other hand, been significant positive developments in the study of the Holocaust as a result of several trends. An especially important trend has been the declassification of very important relevant records. The agreement of the British government in 1996 to the opening of their interception and decoding of the reports of the German order police has transformed our understanding of the early stage of the Holocaust in 1941. It is now clear that these police battalions included not only about 10 times as many men as the murder commandos, the Einsatzgruppen, over 25,000 as compared with close to 3,000, but also undoubtedly killed far more Jews than the commandos, whose reports, because of their far earlier availability for research, had been a central piece of evidence in all prior studies of the subject and remain of great importance. The recent publication by the German city of Bremen on the participation in the Holocaust of 2 police battalions from that city both supplement what we already knew about such units and also provides vivid details of their participation in such specific operations as the notorious September 1941 mass murder of over 30,000 Jews in the Ukraine at Babi Yar near Kiev, as well as their guarding of transports of Jews from the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands to Auschwitz beginning in the summer of 1942. Perhaps other German cities will follow the example of Bremen and facilitate first the research on and then the publication of the activities of the police battalions that originated in them. As for the real number of those who participated in the killing process, we need to remember the special units attached directly to Himmler's headquarters, some 10,000 men, who, when added to the Einsatzgruppen and order police, make for a total of over 40,000 men. Surely an adequate number for the killing of millions. Additional important information has come to light with the declassifications that came out of the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure and Imperial Japanese Records Act passed by the American Congress. A major feature of that law was that it lifted the automatic exclusion from declassification review and from the implementation of freedom of information requests of two categories of American records: those relating to intelligence sources and methods, and those called, quote, foreign government information, a general name utilized by the U.S. government for material provided to the United States by a foreign government that had a security classification at the time it was given to our government. While records in the former category could now be and were subjected to systematic declassification review, in the latter case, the government that had provided the material, and for World War II this generally meant Great Britain, would be asked for its consent to declassification. The procedure in the former category relatively promptly led to massive declassification, and work on these newly opened materials is only just beginning. In the process of requesting permission to declassify in the latter category, it turned out that the British were unusually cooperative. As chair of the Historical Advisory panel, advising the interagency working group that had been established to implement the new law, I was told by several of those at the working end of the declassification process that this rather dramatic break with all their prior experience in dealing with the British on the declassification records was most likely due to the widely known personal interest of then President Clinton in the general topic. If there were a holdup reported to him, he might telephone his friend, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, at 10 Downing Street, and those in the relevant offices in and near London did not want a rocket from 10 Downing Street, since by definition the records in question were at least half a century old. The highly unusual rapidity of agreement to declassify was unlikely to cause any real problems for British security. An important byproduct of the declassification of American intelligence records was the publication of books by Richard Brightman and others about the post-war American recruitment of Nazis, some with exceedingly dubious records, by American intelligence agencies. One information with the consent of the British government is the collection of summaries of British interrogations of War Commando leader Otto Ohlendorf in the summer of 1945, before he was turned over to the Americans in December of that year, and which Hilary Earle could therefore utilize for her book on the Nuremberg trial on the murder commando leaders. It is reasonable to expect that in the coming years, other researchers will find important information in the material that the British allowed the American government to open up. Obviously, the American government could ask for declassification of only those British documents of which copies had been given to it at the time. That left open the question of British records, especially of their intelligence services, of which no copies were to be found in American archives. That process has also been moving forward, slowly but steadily, in recent years. And scholars like Stephen Tyas have been making good use of these newly opened records. We can expect important publications based on these declassified records in the coming years. While much of the record declassified in the last 40 years remains to be explored and exploited by scholars, there is a trend in the scholarship of the recent past that can only be welcomed. A number of researchers have looked closely at the individuals in the bureaucracy of murder at all levels and have produced fine studies that enable us to obtain a realistic picture of those who made the Holocaust work in practice. Christian Ingrau's Believe and Destroy Intellectuals in the SS War Machine, published in France in 2010 and appearing in an English language in 2013, may serve as a fine example. Other studies which have brought us insight into the individuals whose eager participation was essential in the killing process have been prepared by Michael Wilt and edited by Klaus Michael Mollmann and Gerhard Paul. The book on the German military's participation in systematic murder in Belarus by Waitman Bjorn is especially revealing in the way the killing of Jews became something of a standard procedure for ordinary German soldiers on the Eastern Front. On the other side of the process is the clearer view we can obtain about the victims of such works, as Christopher Browning's 2010 book, Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp. A fundamental work on the whole issue of Holocaust history is Henry Friedlander's The Origins of Nazi Genocide, From Euthanasia to the Final Solution, while an approach to a key aspect of the reality of that terrible time can be seen in the account of Father Patrick Dubois, The Holocaust by Bullets, a priest's journey to uncover the truth behind the murder of 1.5 million Jews. You may be surprised by my omission of the arguments over the issues surrounding the Jewish councils established by the Germans and subsequently often killed, along with members of the Jewish communities from which they had been recruited. Please forgive me if I stress the point that the members of those councils did not know what anybody else on earth knew, how and when the war would end, and what would be the situation of their communities when that happened. There is now also a clearer perspective on two quite different facets of the events. A way in which some tried to profit from the murder of their former neighbors is illustrated quite dramatically by the 2012 book of Jan T. Gross, Golden Harvest, Events at the Periphery of the Holocaust, which offers insight into the digging up of both the dead and related materials for profit by substantial numbers of diggers. On the other side, the way a few Jews tried to protect themselves and their families by aiding the Nazis is described by Peter Wyden's 1992 book, Stella, which recounts the activities of a notorious Jewish woman who assisted the Nazis in catching Jews trying to survive with false identities or in hiding in wartime Berlin. If the descendants of the woman who betrayed Jews to the Nazis have problems engaging their situation with this ancestry, it is worth considering those of Jennifer Teague, the woman who, as an adult, makes the discovery that her mother was the daughter of the murderer Anton Amangold, who is shown shooting Jews as a form of morning entertainment in the famous movie Schindler's List. She not unreasonably entitled her memoirs, "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me." She now does some speaking for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum about her experience and findings. While referring to the recent literature in the field, I should also comment on our vastly improved understanding of the concentration camp system as a result of specialized work on that subject. We now have Nicholas Wachman's KL, A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps, the book of Timothy Ryback on the earliest killings at Dachau concentration camp, and Sarah Helm's carefully researched and detailed study of Ravensbrück, Life and Death in Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women. In general, what we are increasingly seeing is the publication of books by scholars and journalists who have utilized whatever is now available to create accounts of portions and aspects of the Holocaust that can be much closer to definitive than was possible in the early years of scholarly attention to the subject. Furthermore, there are now journals devoted to the subject, like Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and which regularly also contains peer-reviewed articles and book reviews in the field. There is the important series Lessons and Legacies, published by Northwestern University Press on behalf of the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Skokie, Illinois, which has also begun to publish an annual helpful bibliography of Holocaust studies. There is, in addition, the important series entitled Yad Vashem Studies, published by the Yad Vashem Institute in Jerusalem. Clearly, I could go on and mention a substantial number of additional authors in their books, but the point that ought to be clear is that the field obviously attracts serious scholars in many countries. This generalization certainly applies to Israel, the United States, and Germany, as well as other European countries. Since German universities make it a practice to produce fine scholars, but to hire only minute numbers to teach enormous so-called seminars, many of the German scholars have to do their teaching in other countries, like Peter Longerich, who teaches in England, and Christian Gerhard, who teaches in Switzerland, and who have both published very important works in the field and are quite likely to produce even more. Another major development of the recent past is the establishment of centers for the study of Holocaust in this country, in Washington, D.C., and a substantial number of other American cities, several universities, and in other countries as well. These not only produce significant studies and support research and publication in the field, but they also contribute in an important way to the knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust by a wider public. The exhibits offered by some of these institutions, most obviously Yad Vashem and the one in Washington, attract very large numbers of visitors and classes of school children and other special groups of adults. This trend interacts with the push in several American states for the inclusion of some information about the Holocaust in the public school curriculum. It is in regard to this latter suggestion that the passage of 75 years has significant implications. For the current generation of youngsters in school, both the fighting of World War II and the Holocaust are essentially as remote as the events of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. If the dangers and implications of the events we discuss are to become a part of the memory inheritance of the current and future generations, this aspect of the issue is certain to increase in importance in the future. May I suggest that a significant issue all of us need to confront and engage is this divergence between a clearer and more thoroughly based published scholarship about the Holocaust on the one hand, and the general mental distance from it and the war of which it was an important part on the other. It is in this regard that the passage of 75 years and the likely continuation of both trends place a special burden on those of us who work in the field. We not only have the responsibility of informing ourselves about the events of those years, and where and when that's possible, to add to the existing body of knowledge by careful research and publication, but we also need to try to find ways to remind our society of the enormous dangers to the human condition that once led to the deaths of millions, and that can recur if people do not exercise great care. We may know in broad detail, and often in some detail, how a society can go horrendously wrong in spite of prior fine traditions and a high level of education. The reality that the events of the Holocaust recede into an ever more distant past in no way eliminates the possibility that other societies on any continent could potentially move in a similar direction. The Germans, who initiated and implemented the Holocaust, did not belong to some separate species of beings on Earth. Who can predict with any confidence which society, on which continent, might react to the future impact of climate change, for example, by some horrendous policy toward neighbors believed or assumed to be either responsible for their deprivation or of having profited from the dramatic change that is affecting them. Another significant development in the field of Holocaust studies has been its inclusion with other genocides in centers, programs, and courses. This is a development that should not, in this speaker's opinion, be opposed. It is essential, however, that in the process there not be any gliding over of distinctive features of the Holocaust that have not been a part of any other of the horrors that we call genocide. I'm not suggesting that the Holocaust is worse than other genocides, but there are significant differences between it and the other genocides that the courses and programs cover. The most obvious of these fundamental differences, I would suggest, is the geographic one. All other genocides had a specific geographical focus. Those who killed others invariably did so to remove a hated population element from a specific area. The Armenian genocide was a terrible event in the Ottoman Empire. Those who ordered and those who perpetrated it were not interested in Armenians who had settled in the United States, Latin America, or anywhere else outside the Ottoman Empire. The Ustasha, who were busy murdering Eastern Orthodox Christians in the World War II puppet state of Croatia, were not planning to kill Eastern Orthodox Christians who had moved to Chicago or lived anywhere else in Europe. The Holocaust was a project to kill all Jews on the globe, regardless of location. The Allies were successful in containing it and thereby saving approximately 2/3 of the intended victims. But that was most certainly a great disappointment to those who initiated and implemented that particular genocide. Another difference between the Holocaust and other genocides is the routinized preparation of it and its routinized implementation by vast numbers of officials, soldiers and others, over a period of 4 years before they were halted. There are other differences, but the two I've mentioned should make the point. This development in Holocaust studies makes even more important than the special professional concern of historians and other scholars the major issues of access to records on the one hand and the preservation of records on the other. The American records relating to the Holocaust have been systematically declassified. This does not preclude the possibility that some items that were misfiled or not recognized as related to the subject can turn up in the future, but that is and will always be a possibility in the masses of modern records. The relevant German records in Germany, and any still held in the United States, Britain, and France, are also, as far as we know, accessible, or in the process of being opened. The Germans have been working hard to obtain permission to microfilm German records that were captured by the advancing Red Army and are scattered in archives all over the Russian Federation in exchange for giving the Russian a set of the films. The extent to which these provide additional information on the Holocaust is largely unknown at this time, but suggests an important collection of materials to be utilized in future investigations. As I mentioned earlier, the British have been declassifying their holdings of intelligence files from World War II, and it is reasonable to expect that before too long, that process will be completed. In other European countries, the process differs from state to state, and a complete survey of that issue remains to be prepared and published. That's a suggestion for a doctoral dissertation topic offered at no charge. This situation leaves for consideration the two major types of relevant records of the existence of which we know, but are not as yet fully accessible to scholars. These are some of the files of the Presidential Archive of the Soviet Union and the World War II intelligence files of the Soviet Union, both held and kept wholly or partially closed by the current regime in Moscow. The Presidential Archive is, of course, especially important for a wider range of issues of Soviet foreign and domestic policy. Still closed portion of it may well contain some reference to information on the Holocaust that was provided to Stalin during the war. Almost certainly, much more important for our topic are the Soviet World War II intelligence records. In addition to whatever they may contain about Soviet intelligence reports on the situation in the parts of the Soviet Union occupied by the Germans and their allies, and also elsewhere in Europe, there is the quite probably even more important issue of decoded intercepts of German radio messages.
Excuse me a second.
The Soviet intercept stations were far closer geographically to German military and administrative offices sending messages from Poland and the occupied Soviet Union than the British Y stations in England, North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually in Southern Europe. There may therefore, the Soviet records, they may therefore include individual or whole sets of messages not intercepted by the British and either already declassified or in the process of declassification currently. Just as the declassification of British intelligence records has opened up and continues to open a whole series of new perspectives on some aspects of the Holocaust, so any substantial opening of Soviet intelligence records is very likely to provide new insights as well as further significant details. As you don't need to be reminded, the Soviet Union dissolved over 2 decades ago. At first, there was thereafter a very substantial opening of access to records. But over the years, there has been in the Russian Federation something of a reversal, ironically precisely in the years in which in other countries there has been an increasing willingness to open records up. Certainly there has been more access both to Russian scholars and to those from other countries than was true in the former Soviet Union. But the reality remains that the situation has been for some years and is currently behind that of all the other major World War II allies. As I will point out in the next portion of this talk, the current restrictive policy is extremely likely to keep even those who insist on locking up parts of the record from ever being able to benefit from reading it themselves. The issue of access is very closely related to the issue of preservation. In World War II, all belligerents deliberately utilized poor paper in order to use their records for more important things than such current issues as reports on the situation, orders for the immediate action, and requisitions for paper clips. That paper is in the process of disintegrating, and some of it is already no longer readable. If it's not microfilmed, it will be permanently inaccessible to its guardians as well as interested scholars. This is an important aspect of the still closed records that has not received the attention that, both in my judgment and experience in researching World War II records, it deserves and desperately needs. I remember urging the head of the German Federal Archive in Koblenz in 1962 to microfilm any and all records that had not been microfilmed when in Britain and the United States. He was clearly so certain that now that the records were back in clean German hands from the messy custody of the archives of the Allies, the paper would last forever. So he dismissed my advice as superfluous. Fortunately, his successor realized that World War II paper deteriorates, regardless who has custody of it, and inaugurated a large project to film the records of the Chancellor, the Reichskanzlei, for example. There were no doubt some agencies that had good paper left over from earlier times or choices, but these would not necessarily be the most important ones. In a file of the German Army Group defending Berlin in the last weeks of the war, I noticed when we were microfilming those records in the 1950s that there was among the already then barely legible sheets of deteriorating paper one piece of correspondence on elegant, well-preserved paper. It carries the carefully printed letterhead of der Bevollmächtigte des Reichsführers SS für das gesamte Diensthunde- und Taubenwesen, the plenipotentiary of the Reichsführer SS for all military dog and pigeon matters. The records of that office, if they still exist somewhere, will be found to be on fine paper, but they are unlikely to be of great significance for an understanding either of the war or of the Holocaust. Closely related to the issue of deteriorating paper, though rarely mentioned in connection with it, is the issue of inaccessible electronic records. No one wants to hear this, but the reality is, and is practically certain to remain, that records in electronic format remain accessible even fewer years than those on the deteriorating paper I just mentioned. Those who do not want to believe what I'm about to say are welcome to their view. But if that's your opinion, please remember to ask any office, library, or archive that you visit or work in hereafter the following question. How many machines do you have that can read a 5-inch floppy disk? The reality is that technology changes and is certain to continue to do so. Electronic records, even if they don't deteriorate and are transmutable in subsequent forms of electronic records, are certain to be inaccessible in a decade or two. In a American government advisory committee that I was in the late 1990s, the members were informed that the US government could no longer access very substantial portions of its own records of the Vietnam War. This is certain to be a continuing problem as people refuse to engage the reality of technological change. Digitization is fine as long as all involved recognize that this is a format that facilitates access from widely scattered and distant locations, but only for a short time, most likely a decade or the most 2 decades. Microfilm will last 75 to 90 years before it needs to be mechanically duplicated, a well-deserved process that has to be repeated at subsequent equal intervals. Such processes as HD Rosetta, in which miniaturized letters are engraved onto small metal plates, will produce an item that will last for centuries, can be employed to create several copies simultaneously, and turn out a product that can always be read, because the one thing we'll always be able to do is to magnify as we read. But to the best of my knowledge, practically no one is practically pushing in this direction. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is currently raising funds for a permanent home for its holdings of documents, testimonies, and pictures. One can only wish them well in this effort, but realistically, we have to recognize that much of the record scattered in numerous archives, libraries, and other institutions will simply not be accessible to future scholars and the public because it has not been preserved in an accessible, physical, or electronically accessible form. Moving records into the clouds may turn out to be the most effective and secure way to assure permanent preservation of records, whatever their current format. But this procedure is in its beginning stage. This somewhat sad note brings me to a very different question. In what direction might the study of and research on the Holocaust move in the coming years? There will surely be further studies of the Holocaust in specific portions of German-controlled Europe, the reach into the Dodecanese Islands in Asia, the plans for an ever wider reach of the final solution, and of the roles of perpetrators at different levels, as well as participation of local collaborators in German-occupied and Allied lands. We may also see future studies of the post-war fates of both survivors and perpetrators. In regard to the former, there will quite likely be some further attention to the DP, displaced persons camps, and those who left them to resettle in countries all over the world. In regard to the latter, we may see further studies of the type published by David Messenger and Katrin Perler. We can also expect some further exploration of the extent to which Allied governments found out about the Holocaust, at what time, in what detail, and with what impact, if any. A point about the records of intelligence record agencies, and especially their collections of decoded German messages, is an aspect of the documentary situation that has often been overlooked in the 75 years since the end of the Holocaust. As the Allies advanced in the later years of the war, they both drew nearer to the German stations sending radio messages, so there were fewer garbles and missed messages, and also their ability to decipher intercepted messages improved. Furthermore, one byproduct of the Allied bombing campaign was that it obliged the Germans to resort increasingly to the use of radio subject to interception instead of teletype, mail, or messengers. At the same time, more and more paper German records were either destroyed deliberately by the Germans or were lost to fighting and bombing. The result is that as the surviving German record gets slimmer, the Allied record grew more complete and thicker. In this regard, my previous comments on the preservation issue are especially relevant. The issue of preservation must also be seen in connection with the trials of war criminals in the post-war era. The mimeograph paper of those years will not be readable much longer, and some of it is not readable now. The U.S. National Archives has done a considerable amount of microfilming in the records of the subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg, but the transcripts and documents of numerous trials still await a filming program. There were many trials in the Soviet zone of Germany, and those records are also often on deteriorating paper. The denazification proceedings raise the same issue of preservation, and so do the records of the office established by the German government in Ludwigsburg to investigate those who might be charged in trials for their offenses during the war. And this agency holds very extensive records on its investigations and the materials collected for them. This problem of preservation, of course, also applies to the records of war crimes trials held by such countries as Poland, France, Italy, and others. What we all face, and what our successors in these fields are certain to face, is that with the passage of additional years, the physical issue of preservation of records will increasingly dominate the problem of accessibility of records, that has been so important in the past. Nobody wants to hear this, and you are therefore entitled to close your ears. But the great risk is that in the future, those wishing to do research on the Holocaust could find themselves in the situation that historians of the ancient world face all the time: reliance on surviving monuments, tombstones, coins and fragments of works on decent rack-based paper with reproduced microfilm, records put into the clouds, and engraved metal plates as their only modern supplement. If what I've just said is not bad enough, I should add that the paper of many books and journals dealing with Holocaust subjects is also in the process of chemical self-destruction. These are not pleasant prospects, but the passage of 75 years will soon place us in a situation that there are few alternatives for those who want to engage a very extraordinary and important part of world history in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this broad view and long view also, which covered so many aspects, and it could have served for a lengthy discussion on a lot of issues. I may add one personal point of one of my findings, that is that regarding the global vision of the final solution, that the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung in Berlin, headed by Iceman, on the 6th of August 1941, instructed the Roof Organization of German Jewry to provide a list of Jews all over the world. And there you find, as you mentioned, cities in the United States and regions in Palestine and all over the world, except for New Zealand. I don't know why, but that's it. But so this listing, for the actual implementation was there already in August 1941. That's just one addition from my perspective. Anyhow, thank you very much, and we can clap our hands again. I think that's it deserves.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering if you could comment at all on the state of Holocaust scholarship in the Eastern European countries, Romania, Poland, well, those two specifically, but
Lithuania, Hungary.
possibly. Yeah.
For many years, to the best of my knowledge, scholarship in those countries was actually done by people from other countries who went there to do research on what had happened. It is only in the most recent years that there has been the beginning of serious research by people within the area. And as is perhaps either best or worst, whichever term you want to use, leading to controversy in Lithuania. But one of the aspects of this which at least I think is important is that if this trend continues, it may bring us angles, perspectives, and views that in the preceding years, the research on events in those areas might need some modifications in one direction or another, because the authors, the scholars and authors from the outside may not have taken into consideration background factors, elements of culture and perspective in those countries that are, if you will, almost taken for granted by those who have grown up and lived there, and will therefore give us a more realistic or perceptive view of the events there. That would be my answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Professor, first of all, it was a remarkable lecture this morning, and I learned a lot from it. I had a question though relating, you definitively placed the decision of Hitler and Himmler, the decision to kill all the Jews of Europe, to June 1941, before the Soviet invasion. Browning, for example, dates the decision somewhere in the fall of 1941, already after the invasion. I saw Friedlander in his book, the famous book, the Nazi Extermination of the Jews, or whatever it's called, dates it to December 1941, and the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor. So why do you date? You dated differently, and you said that it was a meeting between Hitler and the Romanian Prime Minister, and it's clear from the documents that the decision was made by June 1941. But then what do you say to Browning, Friedlander, and others? The general historiography is that the decision was made sometime in the fall of 1941, after the invasion.
Well, I suggest, as occasionally I have done to students when I was still teaching, look at the documents. There is a record of the conversation between Hitler and Antonescu. That record was made by a Romanian associate of Antonescu who was there. Because there was no German record made at the time, the contemporary, we're talking of June 41, Germans obtained a copy and translated it of the Romanian record. And a German who was there at the meeting certified that the record is accurate. You can find this published decades ago in the relevant volume of the Documents on German Foreign Policy, published by the American government, auspices of the State Department. It's the big series. And there is in the footnote the reference to the confirming statement by one of the German Foreign Office officials. There are many instances, I am afraid, where people have found it preferable to fabricate fairy tales in their studies or the reading room of some archive. It has always seemed to me more appropriate for historians to examine those documents which have been published and then to go to archives and look at those which haven't been published. Ansel is a scholar who has written extensively on Romania's role in connection with the Holocaust. And he stresses and goes into elaborate discussion of this. And I have worked in the German documents where it is clear that originally Hitler was planning to meet with Antonescu earlier in June than the one that took place on the 12th of December. I hope you will forgive me if I compare this to another area where folks have found it easier to fabricate than to analyze the record. And that is on the dropping of the atomic bombs. There are endless fairy tales. It is not that exciting to go to College Park, Maryland, and work for weeks on end, all day long, on the tens of thousands of decoded intercepts of Japanese messages. But there you can find the real record. The real record that Japanese diplomats in Europe in the spring of 1945 were advising from Stockholm, from Madrid, from Moscow, their government in Tokyo not to follow the stupid German example of fighting to the very, very bitter end. And you can see there the selection of these that was provided to the president and his top advisors. And there you will find a very long, detailed analysis and suggestion in this direction by Sato Naotake, the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, who tells Tokyo, don't do what you're now planning, go to the bitter end like the Germans, call it off and surrender. And there you can also find the answer from the Japanese foreign minister, who thanks Sato for his advice, tells him that he has taken it to the Japanese council, and they have unanimously voted to reject his advice. Thank you very much. It was under those circumstances that the president, with the agreement of his top advisors, decided to divert a maximum of 2 atomic bombs from those which were already, it had been already decided and were planned to be used in support of Operation Olympic, the invasion of the Japanese home island of Kyushu. And that is what happened. The hope was the council would meet again and perhaps come up with a different answer. And as we know today, that is exactly what happened. The council, after the second one, met again, split evenly on the issue. I won't go into the details now. The emperor then stepped in and said, we'll call it off. There was an attempted coup, and the man who was to head the coup, Anami Korichika, in the divergence between his belief in what was the right policy for Japan, he was one of the half who wanted to go on with the war, and his having been personally present when the emperor gave the word the other way, rather than head the coup, committed suicide, and the surrender was. You will not find references to any of these relevant documents that have been available since the early 70s in College Park in any of the published fairy tales about the dropping of the atomic bombs. And in those who imagine various dates for Hitler's decision, you will not find reference, not an argument that maybe the record by the Romanians was wrong, or the German officials shouldn't have agreed with it. People just have found it easier to sit either at home or in a library reading room and fabricate. I'm sorry, but that's in reality what has happened. We also know from the published version of Himmler's diary that spring of 41 beforehand, he met with Hitler. The only reason that we have so many of Hitler's views on this subject in diplomatic documents is that there was the practice in the Foreign Office of keeping records of Hitler's meetings with foreign leaders. Records were not kept of his meetings with German leaders, which is why we know that both Speer and first Raeder and then Dönitz, who knew that there would be no record unless they kept one instead. Himmler only kept a record of the time and day that he met. The meeting, as I mentioned earlier today in my talk, of a top official with the Einsatzgruppen, the murder squad leaders, was not documented at the time. But obviously now that we know that somewhere between 30 and 50,000 Germans were instructed before the 22nd of June 1941 that they were to kill Jews in the newly occupied Soviet Union systematically. The notion that this decision was invented by some official in the Reich Security Office and Adolf hadn't yet made up his mind is preposterous. This was not the local decision of some German lieutenant, captain, or major. This was a decision made at the top, obviously communicated by Hitler personally to Himmler, and then it was passed on, as we now know for sure, before the invasion to the commanders of the murder squads, the Einsatzgruppen, and to the commanders of the order police. And one cannot understand that without keeping in mind who those commanders of the 20,000 or so order police were. They were men, officers by this time, who had made their careers in the police, which in the Germany of the time meant very little shooting. German crooks, by and large, didn't have guns. So any German policeman would remember the very few occasions in his career that he actually had to use a gun. We have to see this in terms of the context of reality. And the battalion commanders, like the Einsatzgruppen, murder squad commanders, had to be told ahead of time, you're going to be shooting in vast numbers. And then you report on it. And it is interesting that back in the 70s, as I mentioned earlier today, the British declassified the reports of their intercepts of the reports of the order police. So here you have, starting in June 41, order police units, hundreds, thousands of miles and kilometers apart, regularly reporting on the numbers of Jews that they have just shot in the preceding 3 or 4 days. These documents have now been accessible to scholars for 45 years. The notion that these units scattered behind the German army groups on a front stretching all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea are regularly reporting on their killing of Jews just because they didn't have anything else to do, or because they all simultaneously, independently, came to the conclusion this is a good thing to do. It's complete nonsense. And what is interesting is that, as we know, that in late September of 41, they are told the units scattered behind that huge front are informed that they should continue reporting, but that the reports on the killing of the Jews should be in a different and more complicated code. The only conclusion that those folks in the order police could draw from this was, we're doing the right thing, but we've got to change the reporting mechanism. And the notion that this is going on in September on the basis of a Hitler order delivered months later is, in my opinion, preposterous. One has to examine the reality. The relevant documents have now been accessible to scholars literally for decades. My suggestion is that it's about high time that I should not be the only one to look at them. They weren't written for me. They were
Maybe
written.
on this note, we should...
But still, may I ask you, because I'm also a neo-intentionalist. I also define myself as a neo-intentionalist. But I want to make it a little bit more difficult for you, because I quote you often, and it's a lecture at the USHMM, I think about 20 years ago, where you pinpoint the moment to the meeting which was not recorded on the 16th of July 1941, where you say that is the watershed moment, because from that moment onwards, after the meeting you see what Himmler does and others, and so I interpreted that as your view that it was that moment, and that's in the lecture.
In the lecture is that at that point in time, Hitler talks to Quaternik, the Croatian Minister of War, and talks about the extension of the killing program from the newly occupied portions of the Soviet Union to all parts of Europe controlled by the Germans. At a time, in other words, when Hitler was like, I quoted in my talk this morning, Halder, the Chief of Staff, convinced the thing was going well on the Eastern Front, that Hitler tells Quaternik that now we are extending the killing program from where we started, the newly occupied parts of the Soviet Union, to all portions of Europe that we control. France by this time, Czechoslovakia, now in the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and Slovakia, etc., etc., etc. That is the extension, if you will, of a program that is already underway, and by this mid-July meeting, tens of thousands of Jews in the newly occupied part of the Soviet Union have already been killed. And the thing that people always ignore in this occasion, in this regard, is what the exceedingly stupid German generals always excluded. And that is, if you look at your atlas, there's a page on Spain, a page on France, a page on Italy, a page on Russia. But if you want to look at that and learn something from it, you have to look at the lower right-hand corner where the scale is. Because that map of the European Soviet Union covers territory bigger than France, Italy, Spain, and a couple of countries combined. And the notion that German murder squads in this huge area are operating and reporting the same way on the mass killing of Jews just because of some coincidental coordination is preposterous. Military units operate, this is a big surprise I know to all of you, under orders. And they obviously have gotten the same order, so that a unit up into the Baltic states and a unit in the southern Ukraine, they are thousands of miles or kilometers, whichever you prefer, apart. But if they're all doing the same thing and reporting on it, that's what they think they're supposed to do and report on. The notion that this is all a coincidence just doesn't make sense.
I would go back, rewind the tape a bit and say, you told us that it's about time we started working and looking at the documents that you were talking about, so maybe we have our work cut out for us. We want to thank you, Professor Weinberg, thank you, Professor Michman. I want to thank you for coming all the way. This is not, we know the effort involved in flying over from Chapel Hill. Yeah. We really appreciate it. We want to thank you for sharing with us. We've learned a lot. Thank you again and again.